perhaps I mean good morrow. Welcome hither. Welcome to City Break Stratford-on-Avon, Episode 2, which I'm calling Finding Shakespeare in Stratford-on-Avon. Very much the topic du jour, because although it's a lovely little town, riverside setting, Elizabethan houses, etc., there really is only one main reason why millions of visitors make it to Stratford every year, and that, of course, is Shakespeare. So, for this episode, a little biography. There's not a great deal we know, but I'm going to tell you what I do know, mainly focusing on the beginning and end of his life, both of which were more Stratford-related than the middle part, which he spent in London, and then a visit to 5 different places in Stratford, which are connected to him. A little bit on what to expect when you get there, and of course, in true City Breaks format, a little of the cultural background, which will help you understand a bit more of what you're seeing when you get there. So then, shall we wend? Biographically speaking, the records are a little thin, prompting one historian to write the following. All we know is that he was born in Stratford-on-Avon, produced a family there, went to London, became an actor and a writer, returned to Stratford, made a will, and died. That's slightly an exaggeration because there are apparently about 100 documents that relate to Shakespeare in some way or another, his baptism, title deeds for properties he owned, court records, that sort of thing. One thing we definitely don't know for certain is his actual birth date. We know that he was born to his parents John Shakespeare and Mary Arden in Stratford and was baptised in Holy Trinity Church there on April the 26th, 1564. And since the practice was to baptise babies as soon as possible, often on the 3rd day of their life, we guess that maybe his birthday was indeed the 23rd of April. He was named after his godfather. That was another custom of the day. One William Smith, a haberdasher and neighbour of his parents in Henley Street, Stratford, where they lived. We know too that it was really rather against the odds that baby William survived at all. There was plague in Stratford that summer, and church records show that throughout the decade when he was born, the 1560s, there were about 60 baptisms a year and 40 annual child burials. Indeed, it's thought that William's parents had at least 10 children, only 5 of whom survived into adulthood, and that he had 2 baby sisters who both died before he was born. We know that he had brothers, Gilbert, Richard and Edmund, and a sister Anna, who died when she was aged only 7. We know that John Shakespeare, his father, was a glover, so he treated leather, he made it into gloves and sold them. But in common with lots of other Stratfordians of the day, he had more than one source of income. We know from the court records that he was sometimes a brogger, which meant he sold wool without a licence, but he was pretty much a respected citizen, must have been because he was also an alderman and later mayor of Stratford and a justice of the peace presiding over the Court of Record. One interesting thing we know about him is that part of his role as mayor was to inspect travelling theatre companies and decide whether to give them a licence to play in the town. And so, of course, everybody's wondering, is that where Shakespeare got his first introduction to theatre? Very possibly it was. We assume that young William went to school in Stratford. There's no actual definite record of that, but clearly he was educated. There was a very good school in the town, and so we must assume that that's where he went. The gap between him leaving school at 14 and getting married at the rather young age of 18 is a bit hazy. We know that the wedding was arranged rather in haste, took place in late winter 1582 during what was known as the prohibited season, so the period around Christmas when weddings weren't normally conducted. But Anne was probably about 3 months pregnant at the time, and so they had to get on with it. Exactly where they got married is also not known for sure. Various local churches claim it might have been there, but we don't really know. We do know that they had their children, Susanna, christened just a few months after the wedding in 1583, and twins, Judith and Hamlet, born 18 months, perhaps 2 years after that. The trail does then go quite cold. We know that a year or two after the twins' birth, Shakespeare was in London, What prompted that, we're not sure. Did he perhaps return with one of the playing companies that he'd met through his father? Did he just decide to undertake the 3 or 4 day walk down to the big city to seek his fortune? We don't know. But we do know that he returned to Stratford quite regularly, perhaps once a year, perhaps more, and that he invested in the town. He bought property there, he bought land. Perhaps he returned there for quiet periods to write. One definite date is 1596, when his son Hamlet died at the age of only 11 and was buried in the churchyard of Holy Trinity. We don't even know for certain whether Shakespeare attended the ceremony. I think it's quite likely that he did. What we do know is that within a year or so of that, he was working on his play King John, in which he featured a mother whose son had, I think, been kidnapped, had disappeared, and he gave her the following lines, which really do ring as if he's describing his own feelings. Quote, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form." Another known fact is that about a year after Hamlet's death, Shakespeare bought New Place, the second biggest house in Stratford, and settled there for the last 19 years or so of his life. His daughters married. Susanna married John Hall at Holy Trinity Church, and they had a daughter, Elizabeth, who was baptised in 1608. We know that Shakespeare got on well with his son-in-law, made him his heir, in fact, very much in contrast to his relationship with his other son-in-law, Thomas Quiney, whom Judith married, because thereby hung a scandal. Only a few weeks after the wedding, another woman gave birth to Quiney's child, although both she and the baby died very soon afterwards. But Shakespeare was caused by this to revise his will. He did leave some money to his daughter Judith, but nothing at all to his son-in-law, which would have been the custom, the expected thing. We know the date of Shakespeare's death, April the 23rd, 1616, when he was in his early 50s, but we don't know the cause. The closest we can get to finding that out is by no means certain, because it was written some 50 years after Shakespeare's death by one Reverend Ward, who wrote, "Shakespeare, Drayton and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted." We do know that he died in Stratford at New Place, that friends and neighbours will have walked through the house, all the rooms draped in black cloth, and that there would have been a funeral procession from New Place past the school and the Guildhall to Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare was buried in a grave at the high altar, not because he was Shakespeare, but because he had been a tithe holder, so an important member of the local community. There's always been much talk about his will, in which he left 4 properties in Stratford and quite a lot of land and cash, and, as he himself famously wrote, quote, "I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture." I think the furniture was the bedding. I did ask one of the tour guides whether that was really the insult that it sounded to be, and he said he thought not. It was the custom, because the best bed was practically never slept in. It was reserved for important visitors, and the bed he'd left Anne was the marital bed. And also, he said, as his widow, she would automatically get 1/3 of his estate, so there was no need for him to spell out in writing what he wanted her to have. Anne died about 7 years after her husband and is buried next to him in the church. The direct descendancy petered out after a couple of generations. His daughter Judith had a baby, Elizabeth, who grew up to have 3 children, one of whom was a little boy called Shakespeare, but he died in infancy, and the other 2 children died in childhood. So much then for the biography. Let's go on a tour of places where you can find out more. I've picked out 5: Shakespeare's Birthplace, the Guildhall and School, which is one place, Anne Hathaway's Cottage, New Place, so the last big property that he bought, and Holy Trinity Church. Starting then at his birthplace in Henley Street, which you can tour round. That would have been Shakespeare's childhood home, the house he inherited later, the place where his father had his glover's workshop, probably outbuildings out at the back, places to treat leather, somewhere to keep a pig and hens, to grow vegetables and herbs. I read a passage which, although it's fictional, gives quite a flavour of what Shakespeare's childhood perhaps was like in Stratford. It's from a novel called Fools and Mortals by Bernard Cornwell, and it's narrated in the imaginary voice of William's brother Richard Shakespeare, who says the following, quote, "In Stratford as a child I looked forward to Christmas. My mother baked shrid pies, the traditional dish, mixing shredded mutton, which represented the shepherds, with 13 fruits and spices, which stood for Christ and his 12 apostles. She usually made 4 or 5, each large enough to feed a dozen people, and I would help carry the unbaked pies to Hamnet Sadler, the baker in Sheep Street, where all our neighbours would take their own pastries to be cooked in his big ovens. Then, over the 12 days, we would visit each other's houses to eat the pies. There was singing and dancing and laughter. There were wassail bowls of mulled ale, spices and chopped apples. The worst days of winter were yet to come, when the pastures about the town would be hard with frost, and the river might freeze, and the bell of Holy Trinity would toll too often to announce a death. But for 12 days there was the warmth of welcoming hearths, there was food, and there was laughter." There's a good factual description of the house in Peter Ackroyd's Biography of Shakespeare, when he writes that it was a very roomy house, 6 separate chambers, an upstairs and a downstairs, connected with a ladder, and goes on to describe the downstairs as follows. "The hall was the principal room of the house, next to the front door and the cross passage. There was a large fireplace here, and the Shakespeare family sat for their meals in front of it. There was a kitchen at the back of the house, with its usual complements of a hand-turned spit, brass skillets and leather bottles. Beside the hall was the parlour, a combined sitting-room and bedroom, where the bed itself was displayed as a prize specimen of household furniture. The walls here were heavily patterned and decorated." He then goes on to describe the glover's workshop with its busy working by John Shakespeare and apprentices, and to describe the upper floor as follows, quote, "There were 3 bedchambers. Shakespeare would have slept on a mattress of rush, stretched on cords between the wooden frame of the bed. In the attic rooms slept the servants and the apprentices. It was a large house for a tradesman, and reinforces the note of affluence in all his father's affairs." Shakespeare inherited the house in 1601 when his father died. He left it to his daughter Susanna, and it remained in the wider family for quite a number of generations until a trust was founded to restore and look after it. When you go there today, you will find that some of the rooms are furnished as they may well have looked in 1574, when Shakespeare was a 10-year-old, and attached to it then rooms with a museum and information, artworks, etc. The second place definitely worth visiting is the Guildhall and School, which is all one building. The Guildhall part is downstairs, the schoolrooms upstairs. So downstairs in the Guildhall, you can visit the chapel area, a reminder that the building belonged to the church until the Reformation, when it was taken over and became the administrative centre for the town. You are standing where John Shakespeare worked when he was mayor, where the Court of Record was held, which he at different times in his life both appeared before and presided over. You can see the locked box where money and important documents were kept. You can look at pictures of court sessions, information displays. You can perhaps imagine that it was here that maybe the Earl of Leicester's troupe or the Queen's players from London arrived and performed their plays, with Shakespeare's father certainly watching and possibly Shakespeare himself. In fact, we do know that occasionally they would hire some local people to be extras in their performances, so maybe that was what Shakespeare got up to in his youth. If you go upstairs, you find the schoolroom with, in one part, 8 forms or benches set out, one for each age group, so one for the 7-year-olds, one for the 8-year-olds, right up to the 14-year-olds. And in the second part, desks and inkwells. There's usually an actor in situ playing the role of the teacher who will talk you through what it was like to be a schoolchild in Shakespeare's day. And there are things you can try out. For example, have a go at writing with a quill. So, what do we learn about Shakespeare's school days? Well, firstly, that they were very long, a 6-day week, starting at 6 a.m, not finishing till 5 in the afternoon. The children, I should say boys, brought their own candles and fuel, their own books and writing materials, and the aim of the whole exercise really can be summarised as the teaching of fluent Latin, because being fluent in Latin would gain you entry to the universities at Oxford or Cambridge, then lead to one of the professions, maybe medicine or the law or teaching. They learnt perhaps a little Greek as well. You might know the famous Ben Jonson quote, where he said that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek, although possibly that tells you more about Ben Jonson than about Shakespeare. They will have read classical literature too, Roman authors such as Virgil and Horace, maybe some Greek authors in translation, Plutarch and Homer, but really the emphasis was on repetition and rote learning, all those verbs and tenses and declensions of nouns. Very probably there was a little drama too. There's one teacher who's known to have arrived from London in Shakespeare's day and got the boys to act out some of the scenes that they read in their literature. Peter Ackroyd's biography of Shakespeare gives a lot of useful information on this phase of Shakespeare's life, saying that he will have started his learning through a book called Short Introduction of Grammar, that being Latin grammar, obviously, and ended up with a knowledge of the Latin language as good as any undergraduate in classics in a modern university today. And then, in the later stages of his education, Shakespeare will have left grammar behind a bit and moved on to oratory and elocution, and something called rhetoric, which we would call perhaps creative writing. And all of this will have served him very well. As Peter Ackroyd writes, quote, "He knew how to invent variations upon a theme, how to ring changes on the sound as well as the sense of words. He knew how to compose themes and to write out formal orations. He also learned how to avoid hyperbole and false rhetoric, and in his plays he gave these to his comic characters." He goes on to explain that Shakespeare was trained to take both sides of any question, and, as he writes, quote, "What better preparation for a dramatist, and what better training could there have been for the making of Mark Antony's oration in Julius Caesar, or the pleading of Portia in The Merchant of Venice?" It's thought that Shakespeare probably left school a little earlier than some of the other boys. We're not quite sure why. Perhaps the family was indebted. Maybe the thought was that with 3 younger brothers it was their turn. But either way, we don't think he went off to university. We're not quite sure what he did for the 4 years until, at the age of 18, he got married. Most probably he was working in the family business. Anyway, he began courting one Anne Hathaway, a yeoman farmer's daughter from the little village of Shuttery, just on the outskirts of Stratford. They were married under special licence in late November, possibly early December, 1582, when he was 18 and she was, we think, 26. More than that we do not really know, although there is a nice description in the official guidebook to Stratford, which hazards a guess at how things probably unveiled on the wedding day. Quote, "Anne would have worn her best set of clothes, with her hair worn loose and crowned with a garland of herbs, such as rosemary. She would have been escorted by her bridesmaids, who would spread rushes before her to protect her shoes and clothes from the mud of the rutted road to church. William would have dressed in his finest doublet and hose, and been escorted by his male friends to the bride's house with the musical accompaniment of the pipe and the tabor. The groom usually bought gloves for wedding guests, an appropriate gift as his father was a glover, in exchange for herbs and flowers. The ceremony began at the door of the church, and the ring was blessed. Afterwards, the wedding party entered the main body of the church for the nuptial mass." It is, I think, definitely worth going out to Anne Hathaway's cottage, because it's a lovely little wonky thatched affair with idyllic gardens. It's furnished as it probably would have been in Shakespeare's time, and you can see Shakespeare's courting chair, which later generations said, anyway, had been in the cottage when Shakespeare was paying visits to Anne. It has the Shakespeare family coat of arms carved onto it, although there's some idea that maybe that was done later on. Fourthly, New Place, the property which Shakespeare bought in 1597 after he'd made his name and quite a lot of money in London. When he bought it, it was a medieval property built in the 1480s by one Sir Hugh Clopton, whom you may remember from episode 1, another Stratford lad who went off to London and made very good indeed. Shakespeare bought it as a family house. He certainly visited it intermittently, and although sadly it was destroyed by one of its later owners, we do have quite a good idea of what it looked like. Here is Bill Bryson from his book on Shakespeare. Quote, "New Place was the second biggest dwelling in town. Built of timber and brick, it had 10 fireplaces, 5 handsome gables, and grounds large enough to incorporate 2 barns and an orchard. Its exact appearance in Shakespeare's time is uncertain, because the only likeness we have of it is a sketch done almost a century and a half later, from memory, by one George Virtue, but it was certainly an imposing structure. We know that it had a large courtyard, and that at the back of the courtyard was a large medieval hall, probably the scene of feasts and festivities, presided over, presumably, by Shakespeare himself. So today the building is no more. The house next door, known as Nash's House, is a museum where you can learn all about the history of the site, and the grounds around it are definitely worth visiting in their own right. Part of it is laid out as an Elizabethan knot garden, so 4 little square beds, known as knots in the day, planted with shrubs and herbs, and beyond that is the great garden, with an old mulberry tree, said to have been planted from a cutting taken from a tree which Shakespeare himself had planted. Lots of other things to look at as you wander round. For example, a large stone statue of Shakespeare with a quotation from Hamlet. Hamlet was talking about his dead father, but the sentence reads very much today as being appropriate for us to remember its author. Quote, "He was a man for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again." I think it's fair to say there's less to see at Newhall than at the Birthplace or Anne Hathaway's Cottage, but the atmosphere, I felt anyway, is quite Shakespearean. After all, he owned it for 19 years, a period during which he wrote more than half of the plays. We know that he came home fairly regularly. It's thought that perhaps he retreated to Stratford when he wanted a quiet period in which to write, and we know for certain that it was here that he died in 1616. And the 5th place I've picked out really bookends Shakespeare's life, Holy Trinity Church, where he was both baptised and buried. Above his grave, which is inside near the altar, there's a sculpture of him, done by a contemporary, so probably quite a good likeness, and an epitaph underneath, which it's hazarded that Shakespeare himself probably wrote. It's a plea for people to leave his bones undisturbed, and it reads like this. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." I think perhaps he had an inkling that after he himself had gone, Stratford would attract an ever-increasing stream of visitors interested in him and everything about him. His wife and his older daughter Susanna and her husband are all buried nearby, and it's thought that the graves of his other 2 children, Hamlet and Judith, were laid outside in the churchyard somewhere, although the exact spot isn't known. These days, however, as you walk up the church path towards the main entrance, you will pass on the left-hand side 2 rowan trees planted in their memory. Each has a plaque in their memory, giving their names and the dates of their births and deaths, plus a Shakespeare quotation. A lovely way to make sure that they too will always be remembered. Hamlet Shakespeare, 1585 to 96, Judith Quiney, 1585 to 1662. Also in the church you can find a font from Shakespeare's day, very possibly the one in which he himself was baptised. You can see an entry in the church register marking the day when he was baptised. It reads in Latin that the baby was William, son of John Shakespeare. You can see a Bible which was in use in Shakespeare's day, and you can find the tomb of Sir Hugh Clopton, although in fact it's empty because in the end he was buried in a church in the City of London. But all in all, it does seem a place very much connected to Shakespeare, a building he would have known himself, where he almost certainly attended many services, and which marks forever the beginning and end of his life. So then, so much for today's episode. The details here and there are a little scant, but I hope you'll agree that enough is known about Shakespeare and his life in Stratford to allow you to learn really quite a lot more about him and I hope you'll be inspired to visit some or all of the places which I've mentioned. There is a side of Shakespeare's life which hasn't been much mentioned in this episode, and which I'm saving for the next and final one in this little mini-series on Stratford, and that's everything theatrical. So there will be some background history and culture, and visits to all the places in the city relevant to that, particularly, of course, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, but actually a number of other places too. So I hope very much that you will check back in for that, and for the moment it just remains for me to thank you and say goodbye. But I think a little Shakespearean language is called for here. So let me end with 2 phrases which I have rooted out. I bid you thanks, fare thee well.